Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so basically, what I want to talk about is something I found really interesting. I read recently was the Chronicle of the Narvaez expedition. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correct, but you know, uh, I'm sure someone will correct me or whatever. So basically, um, the expedition was written by a guy named Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing it either. I apologize. But so the reason why I want to talk about this is because I just find it fascinating. That I haven't really heard much about this, and I don't think many people have heard much about this. I've asked people I've known that especially really like history, and most of them don't know about him. But basically, um, before I really start talking, I just want to have a bit of an explanation here. So before watching this video, I think you should read the book. This chronicle is very fascinating study on like the mind of these explorers and conquistadors during this time. Why did they did the things they did? What drove them to do that, and how they viewed the indigenous peoples of these areas. Um, and that's the big difference I've seen out of this one compared to some others I've read or have learned about. This guy, I'm just gonna call him Nunez, Alvar Nunez. Uh, his views on the expedition are fascinating. So this is what he looks like. Apparently, I don't know how accurate this photo is, but I see it everywhere and a few others. But let me see if I can go to there. Okay, so this is just an old photo of him. A 16th century map I found. It just show off what what they thought that stuff looked like and the area looked in. But basically, what he does, his expedition, he. I have a photo here. Something, yeah. So sorry, this photo's a little blurry. Some of these photos are blurry, but so yeah, you can see where he goes through. Some of the southern islands, the end of the tail end of Florida, and it goes into Florida and all the way throughout, and then through Texas and then into the New Mexico and Arizona regions, and a bit of California, Southern California area, and then down into Mexico, which is phenomenal. That's insane that anyone was able to map that area. Well, not really map, but explore that area and meet with a lot of the native tribes, especially during this time period, which is, I believe, hold on, let me make sure. I don't want to say the wrong time period. 1527 is when this expedition starts, or when it kicks off mostly. But yeah, so he's in there. He's in there for around 9 years. He's doing this for 9 years, which is crazy. But before let me just say the reason why I'm really talking about this is because uh, it's very different than many other explorers. Throughout the book, we see that he is struggling constantly with his personal beliefs, especially his religious beliefs, but also um, with the natives and his men that he's living with and serving with. But he has a very interesting view on the natives, where he respects them in a certain way, but he also animalizes them, and I think he animalizes them to make himself feel better about the things that are being done to them, the things he's done to them, um, and then later uh, the things they do to him. That helps uh, justify certain things, but but yeah, it's fascinating. So I really implore people to read It's very short, so you can get through it in a few hours. But I thought it was a fantastic read and great. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about my thoughts on this stuff. And also, I've seen a few videos and stuff. The reason why my interest was sparked in this was because I watched a pre-modernist video. He's a great YouTuber that I think people should check out, and he was talking about why the indigenous peoples were uh, why were the Europeans able to go through and conquer certain areas and take the land and all this stuff. And he talks about the lack of cities the indigenous people had, so they weren't used to uh, plagues and stuff that the Europeans had dealt with for a long time, so that helped through that. But there's many other videos that touch on subjects like this. But you will see throughout the book, um, or throughout the account, that the native tribes, the ones he comes across, are actually most of the time struggling uh, to find food. That's like a big thing about, uh, like that's just a big part of um, what they are doing. They're just focused on food constantly looking for food, you know. And most of the time they are only eating one food source, and then when the winter comes or whatnot, they have to find another. But I digress. I'll get into that a little later. So let me go back to slide one where I have my notes on this, so I can make sure I'm not making any mistakes. But essentially, he's born, in the 14, uh, around late 14, or late 1400s. He's born around the late 1400s. To like somewhat of a modest family. His grandfather, though, let's see if I remember. Pedro de Vera y Mendoza was a explorer of the Americas, especially the Canary Islands, and he sold natives and or indigenous people into slavery to Spain, and he conquered a major Canary island. So that's why he was famous. But his dad, I forget what job he held, but it was a modest job. Um, so his family was pretty modest, but because of his grandfather doing something like that, he always wanted to do that. So that's where he kind of gets the inspiration. But later in like early 1500s, 1511, he he starts joining the war, fighting the French, and see that's where we start seeing him kind of rise to power more. Get more respect, militarily wise, and get seen by the higher ups. He also eventually marries, but we don't really know. I don't think what year. It's his relationship was like this fascinating. Her name was Maria Marmoleo. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correct at all, but she was a way more. She came from way more of a wealthy family, and also a family that had way more power royally. Um, but yeah, he marries her around that time. I think probably around after the 1510s. I'm guessing. Maybe before. I don't know exactly. Um, but then he fights in favor of the Spanish King Charles V, uh, as there was rebellion against him, and that's pretty much where he like gets his like high status from that and the respect. So in 1527, um, he's called up to court, and he becomes he's asked to be the royal treasurer for the expedition to America, and the expedition was supposed to be led by the conquistador uh, Panfilo de Narvaez, and this was supposed to explore Florida, which he was given as a reward. But I believe, if I remember, something happened where when Narvaez or Narvaez was in Florida, or he was in America, he wasn't able. He was like imprisoned falsely, I believe, and then when he came back to Europe, they were like, okay, you can. We're sorry that happened here, Florida. Go there. and see what you can find. If you can find anything, whatever you look, whatever you stumble upon, that's yours. Whatever you deal with it. Um, but so yeah, they call up Cabeza de Vaca, um, Alvar, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, and he becomes the treasurer. So they go on this journey with hundreds of men. I believe it was 600 men in total, but the number changes because of ships getting lost and a bunch of chaos and people dying constantly and whatnot. But so so essentially, let me go to let me see if I can find. What else okay, let's just go to slide 3 again. So yeah, so basic summary. I'm not gonna go too deep into it, but basic summary. He gets into southern islands here. Let's see, move this over here. Okay, yeah, but yeah, he gets southern islands over here, near Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo down here. But yeah, they restock. They lose. A hurricane hits, and some of their ships get damaged or whatever. They're stuck here for a while, but then they get into the Florida area, and all hell breaks loose. I mean, it's complete chaos. What happens? So ships getting lost, losing contact with each other, struggling on land for years, and eventually just boils down to he's in charge of his own ship and the crew there, and then it gets dwindled down into just him and a few others, and then the indigenous people capture him a few times, and he's a slave for a bit, and he gets passed around, and you see some of the other survivors, and they try to escape and whatnot. And at one point, he becomes a trader, like a local trader, and he just travels around to different tribes and trades skins and food and stuff, which is very fascinating. Um, but this happens for 9 years, right? So this is crazy. So he's in America, North America, for 9 years, traveling with indigenous people and three of his other. Well, I want to say two were uh, workers, and then one was a slave, I believe. Um, but yeah, so they travel. It takes them 9 years to get through all this until they eventually get back home. But so he writes through all the accounts of different tribes he comes across, um, and so my thing I was really fascinated by was how a lot of these tribes lived. They were most of them didn't farm because it seemed like it was very hard from the farm, especially in these coastal regions, because of the constant storms and the winter. So a lot of them ate like roots by the shore. There was a certain root they could eat in certain seasons, but when it ran out, they would go for crustaceans or whatnot. But that's just all they would eat, and which is that sounds terrible, by the way. Like just eating one food constantly. But they would like move inland, and try to look for more meat and stuff. But it seemed very rough, you know. And this is throughout all where he explores. These tribes are constantly, all these different tribes are having trouble finding food. When he gets more to the west, it seems like the main food over there was cactus fruit. Um, but when they couldn't find that, they would have to keep moving to find more cactus fruit because that was their main source. Sometimes they would eat lizards or other things they found. But that's like throughout all the regions he explored where they just were not finding any food anywhere. And they would go days or sometimes weeks without food, and then they would finally find something big, and then they would eat for a little bit. But this happened all the time. So you can kind of understand when you read that why these natives or these indigenous peoples um, were so eager to trade with these Europeans. Um, they lacked a lot of these supplies. They had metals and stuff. That was a big thing. They had things that the Europeans were very interested in. Um, so they would trade easily, so they could sell these things they saw as valuable for more food and whatnot. But of course, not all tribes were doing that, because some of them did have a lot of huge supply of corn. That was pretty prevalent. I read a lot of these tribes had corn in their villages, but the explorers would come and just steal it all, which is terrible. But also, I think a lot of the tribes, they would be warring against each other, and they would steal food from each other. But yeah, so a lot of them were low on food, and they would be constantly moving. They were very nomadic. They did not farm much. These southern tribes, so they were just going kind of moving inland, moving more west to find more food, and then they would go to one area, and then they would go back to the previous area after the season changed or whatnot, so the food would come back. Um, but it's fascinating that he's living like this with his three other compatriots, and the way he views the indigenous people is great, because he humanizes them, right? He sees them as people just trying to survive like him. He doesn't. Sometimes he, you know, calls them animals or less than him, but sometimes he equates them to. Uh, he can empathize with them. He understands why they're doing certain things. He understands their motives. Sometimes he doesn't, but he understands their people. So it's very interesting compared to other uh, explorers we see, which just treat them as animals and lesser than them. But also, big thing is he is trying to spread Christianity, because, of course he is. He's Spanish. Um, in the 1500s, of course he's going to be trying to spread Christianity to the indigenous people. So he's bringing that up a lot and talking to the indigenous people about it. But so another thing is, uh, he is trying to make this expedition sound worthwhile. In this sense, when he gets back to Europe, he wants the king to respect him, and supply him with money and reward him for what he did, because he suffers so much throughout this. He has seen so much, and he's very concerned that he's just gonna be, his reputation is gonna be ruined when he comes back. And so you see throughout the book that he just lies. He often lies and just says things that contradict previous stated things, about like, oh, the bountiful, food in these areas, and you can farm here and there, and there's a lot of resources over here, probably, even though I haven't been there. I heard there's a lot of resources. So he's talking about all this, and like, all these people are really friendly to us, and which they clearly weren't. So he really does not want this to be a waste of time, because he has suffered so much, which of course I can understand. I think anyone can understand that you're gonna lie at least a little bit. So this doesn't seem like a complete waste of time. Actually, let me go to this image, which is blurry. Sorry, but it just shows a little bit. Like, that's just when they first met. Um, some tribes, but it's a different image. So, but as I was saying about him trying to spread Christianity, um, which is a huge part, especially at the ending of the expedition, what he writes about it. So he never mentions his wife, and really not really much or many atrocities done to the indigenous people, or even he doesn't go into much details, because wants to seem modest and whatnot. But he never mentions his wife, which is fascinating. You'd think he'd be talking about how much he misses his wife, or anything, but he never mentions. So I assume that he might have committed some very heinous acts on some female indigenous people, or maybe not even uh, heinous, because it's in certain years he was very well off with some of the tribes, so maybe they just it was consensual and whatnot, and so I could be wrong, but he never mentions his wife, so I kind of see that as like, oh, maybe he was cheating on her. I wouldn't be surprised. But as a Christian man, and this is to the king, obviously, and a lot of people in Europe will read this, he does not want to write about him committing stuff like that, as he's already wrote about atrocities that they committed on the local populations early on. Um, But he so he goes through traveling, up Florida, you know, down down south, and then through Texas, and then New Mexico, and a bit of Arizona, and then through Mexico. But eventually, his final points, he comes across these tribes, and he they ask him. A lot of these tribes kind of see the Christians, as that's what they call themselves, the Europeans, uh, the Christians. They see them as like, because they're like weird religious views, but also that the indigenous people see that they might know more medically. They ask them to heal people constantly. So what him and his three other um, friends begin to do is to heal some of the sick of these tribes, and they do this by it's most of the time it's written in the way of they just put a cross on them and like do a prayer for them. They're praying for the sick people. Now this is where a lot of this is just straight up lying. Where he writes about essentially he becomes a godly figure where he is resurrecting people from the dead. You know, him and his buddies are just healing countless swaths of people, and the indigenous people are going to other villages and tribes and whatnot and getting other sick people and dead people over, and they're just resurrecting and healing all these people, which is obviously not true. That did not happen. And he goes throughout Mexico, and he gathers hundreds to even thousands of indigenous people. They are following him to other tribes, and he writes that every time there's a new tribe they come across, that one gets sacked by the previous tribe. They get all of that stuff. Then they go back, and then that tribe that was sacked follows them, and then that process repeats. And that's what I'm very. It doesn't make any sense to me. But I don't understand why they were doing that exactly. What he was concerned, he states that he was uncomfortable with it, but he was worried that they would kind of turn on him or whatever. So he didn't say anything about it, and he just continued. But so that happens, and then we go back to slide one. So and then that happens. They're healing people, praying to God, and obviously they're not resurrecting people. And it's very interesting that they're kind of right. He's kind of writing in a way that he's like a godly figure, even though he is a Christian. That's a very fascinating thing that he did. So that's a very arrogant and narcissistic thing to do. Even though throughout the book, most of the book, he is very empathetic and reasonable most of the time. But at the end, I don't know if he maybe just I don't know. I don't know. I just don't know why he would do that. Obviously, he wrote the book later. Wasn't writing this all at the same time. So maybe he just wanted to have a happy ending. I don't know. But so they travel down through Mexico, and let me get this correctly. He meets up with the Christians, where Mexico City is, and he talks to um, Alcaraz first, which is he's like the head of this area, and of course Alvar Nunez has all these natives following him. So and of course they tell him like be careful of the Christians, they attack us or whatever. So they are trying the Christians he encounters, especially Alcars, they try to capture a lot of these natives. So the natives begin or sorry, indigenous people. The indigenous people start running off and swaths into the woods and whatnot. And so, Alcars comes to him and he's like, hey, can you help us? You seem acquainted with them. Can you help us, capture them, and get them to work and all this stuff? I'm having trouble. He's like, no, no, I'm not gonna do it. I'm not gonna sell out these people, which is fascinating that he's saying that. But yeah, so he's very against it, and he has to keep going back into the woods to get the indigenous people and talking with them and trying to calm them down. And eventually, he convinces Alcaraz to stop uh, you know attacking and hunting down the natives. but that doesn't really work, and they still do it, which is making Nunez mad and whatnot. But they bring them the four of them to Nuno de Guzman, who is the ruler over this area. He's I forget exactly the magistrate. I believe he's the magistrate. So, you know, Guzman apologizes for everything that's been going on, but he talks to me. He's like, okay, we'll get you back to Europe in no time, whatever. But I believe Nunez stays um, in the Americas, which is so obviously he does not care about his wife because he's just okay with staying in the Americas and not going back to Europe. But so he's I forget exactly uh, what so I think he's ruling over Paraguay, or he's kind of like governing a certain area over there, and then he gets like kicked out for like poor leadership and his crimes, and it's sent back to Europe, and he's punished. Well, goes through trial, but they were like, you already went through enough suffering. But so he loses a lot of his respect and his accolades and whatnot, which is sad, but it's understandable. He did commit atrocities, and it's interesting that um, the Spaniards felt that the things that he did was wrong, even though it was very prevalent in the Americas. They still thought they condemned a lot of these things that were being done over there. So yeah, so he loses pretty much everyone's respect. He's the laughing stock. Uh, some um, some sources I read say that he was poor after this, but I don't think that's true because he pays to get his brother out of prison, which I don't know exactly why he was in prison. So obviously he didn't die poor, but he did die with like no respect. And I don't know what his wife, if he was still married to her, and um, what her views on the whole thing were, but they definitely were not as powerful as they were before the expedition, and nobody really respected him, even though he released the expedition to the public, and he edited it a few times to make himself look better. It just didn't work out, which is understandable. But it's fascinating. He was seen as a failure, and I don't agree with that at all, because he discovered multiple tribes and multiple regions, uh, and he survived through all of that. Yes, he committed atrocities, especially early on, which is of course terrible, and he deserves punishment. But it's sad that I think he's glossed over in history, and we see a lot of the conquistadors as kind of like just pure evil, and he's one of the guys that's more morally gray, where he hates the natives at one point and sees them as animals, and then later he sees them more as equals, and then eventually he sees them as his worshippers later on, which is fascinating. But I wish more people would talk about him, and there was more things in the media about him. I know there's a movie from I think the 80s, I believe, which is all in Spanish. Um, I haven't watched that obviously, but I think there should be something, more talks about him. He's a fascinating character. He's a tragic character. I implore people to read the this chronicle of the expedition because it's fascinating. The things he goes through and witnesses is just insane, uh, and it's also fascinating to see how the natives lived in these southern regions, and it kind of explains how these Europeans were able to just come in and destroy these regions and genocide these tribes. Uh, but thank you for tuning in. I know this video might have been incoherent and I might just be babbling, but I was passionate about this and I just wanted to record something real quick and maybe inspire people to do some research on this and buy the book, and so but thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Everyone have a good one. Thank you.